Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks. Your in-depth analysis and discussion of current events in the Western Balkans.
Hello and welcome to Seriously Balkans, our first episode after the summer break. My name is Florian Bieber.
Hi, and I'm Damir Kapidžić.
So, in our episode today, we're kind of looking at Ukraine, but much more in terms of the relationship between Ukraine and the Western Balkans when it comes to European enlargement, and how both the aggression of Russia against Ukraine has had an impact on enlargement overall, and also what lessons can be learned, or what is the relationship between the Western Balkans and the Ukrainian new dynamism it's bringing into the enlargement process.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
This time, Seriously Balkans comes from Kiev. During a visit to Kiev, where I participated in discussions about lessons learned from previous enlargements for Ukraine, I caught up with Maria Mezentseva and Nagornyak, two key protagonists promoting Ukraine's integration into the European Union. Maria, who I talked to first, is a deputy of the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, and also the deputy head of the committee in the parliament responsible for European integration. She also represents Ukraine in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and is elected on the ticket of the Servant of the People, the party of President Zelensky. My second interlocutor who I caught up after my trip to Kiev is Nagornyak, who is the Deputy Director General of the government office responsible for coordinating the accession talks for the European Union, and who is very busy trying to push for a beginning of talks as soon as possible. So with both of them, I discussed on what lessons can be learned from the Western Balkans, and also what synergies exist between Ukraine and the Western Balkans in bringing more dynamism into the process. So let's first turn to Maria.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
How do you see one can learn some lessons from the Western Balkans? How much do you see this as an example, or trying to find your own way for Ukraine to the European Union?
Yeah, my EU integration professional life started 13 years ago. And back then, the Eastern Partnership was introduced, but Western Balkans were already in the focus. So it came a little bit earlier. The whole strategy of the EU neighborhood policy was not that developed back then. So Northern Africa, Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, further than Poland and Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc. All this posed a huge, at the same time, opportunities and threats. The first positioned lady, Catherine Ashton, had huge challenges as well, because it was not widely understood why even we should talk about further enlargement. We're already, back then it was 27 still, not 28. UK was still there, but Croatia didn't join yet. So at that moment, we realized that it has to follow every candidate country before even becoming a candidate, has to be filling in the very, very simple, at the first sight, simple rules and criteria. But Ukraine's case, I think, is the most unprecedented. And the fact that in our further process of integration, we should rely on each other together with Western Balkans. That's what we feel even when we talk to parliamentarians of different countries, especially of this region. I'm, for instance, very in touch with Albanian colleagues via Council of Europe mechanism. I am very thrilled what they're doing, and it shows that regardless how small or big as a country you are, your ambitions can be the same. And here, I think we ruined in a positive way, for instance, the understanding or the perception that, look, Ukraine is speeding, the process is speeded up for Ukraine just because the war of aggression occurred already for a second time since 2014. We really don't want to be viewed like that because this is very unprofessional. I would want to say as well that if we compare different association agreements of the EU and the third countries, Ukraine's association agreement with the EU is one of the most complex. And we are all talking about the 7 points of the criteria, but we should not forget also of the AA and acquis and all other technicalities.
How do you see about, as a, representing Ukrainian citizens in parliament, how do you manage these expectations that people expect to join very quickly? And probably, we all know that it doesn't go overnight.
Exactly.
Even in the best case scenario, It will take years. How do you take that lesson?
We try to do information campaigns. We try to have quick deliverables. What are they? These are programs funded by the EU, both Western Balkans, Ukraine and other candidate states, in Moldova as well, Georgia, even though still on the way. And these are financial supportive projects. These are Erasmus+, these are Horizon program for those who are very in-depth into research, education and science. These are exchange programs. And I think here youth can play a better role of communication. The students and young specialists, both from Ukraine and Western Balkans, are recruited by European institutions for short-term internships. I was one of these interns back in the days, which gave me a perspective of actually understanding that this is definitely not a piece of cake. EU integration, everything written in the books is not black and white, and we are proving right now that the rules that are written are not always followed, not saying that someone would be exempt from it. I think we as Ukraine are facing much more difficult experience of integration than some Western Balkan countries, but they feel this pain with us, and this support is evident. Also, we received a lot of humanitarian aid, not from the EU, but from the Western Balkans, and it gives us a feeling that we are not alone. It's not just the formalities of the 50 billion package, the 1.5 billion we're receiving monthly, because we cost ourselves 7 billion per month to pay all the pensions, salaries, etc. This is a huge financial burden we have. Why should we not be on the same page? I don't know. I think it's the common approach. If you fulfill something, you go ahead. But yet again, I want to stress, to explain to the people, to your citizens, to your voters, to your constituency, to the population, it means involving this population in the process. So for instance, we do it via reconstruction. We do some projects where people are involved directly. That would be either internally displaced persons from the occupied territories. They see that the project is funded by the common financial aid of the EU. They see the result, they feel it. So EU integration is already there. Or agriculture facility which suffered, and it's been under demining process. And this business knows that they can rely on efficient demining, which under some surveys might take 753 years. And here we go with all the demining experiences in the countries that suffered wars. It's not, as you say, overnight process. We just can't deactivate them tomorrow. And this is also a very interesting point of contact, because it touches upon many people who suffered from it as an aftermath of war, as a struggling point for development.
I mean, many people, also the Austrian ambassador has always mentioned this idea of staged accession, the idea of kind of getting not full membership, but having these interim steps before that. How is that? Is that something you see as promising for Ukraine as well, or do you see this as a potential delay?
Western Balkans and us would be against, because I think we've staged our position many times, all of us, as candidate countries. We saw it, it was also mentioned by President Macron one day, and I think he changed his position. It's very positive, because France and Germany were viewed always as two biggest engines of the EU enlargement process. They were, back in the days, somehow blocking Eastern Partnership program, but then everyone agreed. Today, we should not invent extra mechanisms. We have the rules, we follow. If we fulfill, we move ahead. We don't fulfill, we make a pause, we amend, we change, and then we follow the next procedural step. I think that would be just unfair to drag us into some staged new approach. So let's not invent a new bicycle.
So you're saying stick to what we have.
Exactly.
Pursue it.
I think we've been on it quite efficiently, both Western Balkans and us. Yet again, different regions, different geographical position. But for instance, I felt in Albania like I'm home. I visited once. I haven't been to Tirana, but I've been to the coast area. It reminded me Crimea, where I used to spend my childhood years. And yet again, this is a security issue. The region needs maybe getting back to 1952 idea of the common army. Replacing NATO? No, but strengthening your own efforts means a lot right now. And I think Poland agrees to that as an outside former member. UK agreed to that. Maybe we should consider that also as a joint initiative with Western Balkans, because it's also a region which needs to be viewed not as a constant threat, of course, but as a possible,
Yeah, there's a security dimension.
Exactly. And it's there. We just can't fly out several countries to Mars and be safe. That's unfortunately not an option. Therefore, I think in this dimension, we can also cooperate better and more together and show it as a reflection to the EU. I am very much afraid of the new leadership of the EU Commission and EU Parliament. I really hope that the stability will be there, but I already see the drops of instability. The political families which are expecting different alignments and representatives, 6 political families. And believe me, I worked with all of them. I am vice president of EPP in the Council of Europe. My political party, President Zelensky Party, Servant of the People, is in ALDE. So it's, for us, it's an interesting game of play. However, it will be very vital for both Western Balkans and us. Who would be the next commissioner for enlargement? Who would be the president of the commission? How would the 6 political families view us? Would they help us? Will we have... And by the way, EPP has a very strong position on the Western Balkans constantly. Yeah. We're constantly being asked as EU committee representatives. But how about Western Balkans? And these are German colleagues, Michael Geller, for instance, my good friend from before, and others who actually insisted on us inserting it as a strong argument when we were lobbying across the EU. So I think I'm taking a task from you right now, and an idea that we have to get back to this peer-to-peer contacts, parliamentary contacts.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
So in my second conversation, I've talked to Ivan Nagornyak. So Ivan shared his thoughts on working actually in the office in charge of negotiations, and how his experience has also brought him together with key negotiators of the accession process from the Western Balkans.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
You're aware, of course, of how long it's been taking the Western Balkans to, join the European Union. I mean, Montenegro and Serbia have been negotiating for a long time. So, how do you, what lessons can you take for the Ukrainian process? How do you think you can, in a certain way, have a faster way into the European Union, considering this experience from the Western Balkans?
I think that taking into account their position and progress over the fundamentals and the amount of attention that the European Commission and member states are paying to the rule of law and anti-corruption measures, the first and foremost lesson is the fundamentals first. And that Ukraine, in order to be on that pace and dynamics of this European integration that is right now, we have to also to bring a progress on the rule of law and anti-corruption. So this is the first and foremost lesson for us. And the next one is, of course, pay attention to the other member states' interests. I saw that some of the Western Balkans, especially, North Macedonia, changed even its name in order to move forward with European integration. I'm right now talking about especially about the Hungary. As you may know, they are paying a lot of attention to the rights of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. This is 2 main lessons. First, the fundamentals first, and second, to have a close communication and understanding of the interests of the other member states.
Yeah, and I mean, these are, I think absolutely correct points. I would agree with you on that. I guess also the challenges, enthusiasm in Ukraine is great among citizens to join the European Union, but also I think citizens expect quick results, right? There's a high expectation that this process will lead to membership soon. How do you manage these expectations? Because the process will take a while, even if, Ukraine can avoid some of the problems the Western Balkans have been facing. So how do you kind of keep expectations there, but also realistic?
Well, of course, after the start of the full-scale aggression and when Ukraine submitted its application for the EU membership, the support for the Ukraine's membership is very high. It's almost 90%, or even during the last polls, it's even higher than 90% for Ukraine to joining the EU. But of course, many of our citizens, they are thinking that the EU is about, the economic prosperity, and this will come just after Ukraine will join the EU. And a lot of people, they are not paying enough attention and they don't get information about all of the reforms that we have to do in order to fulfill all of the obligations. So in the Ukrainian government, we are in the very constant communication with the European Union mission in Ukraine and a delegation in Ukraine. And together we are trying to communicate that this process couldn't go so fast. And some of the measures, they are medium and long term. And we have to plan our budget in order to be able to implement some directives, regulations, and the accession negotiations. They are very, I would say, up to the point. And, this 35 chapters, 6 clusters, and all of this, this cannot be done overnight, of course. And we are trying to send this message to our citizens. Another point that I see that Ukrainian public is also paying attention to is what European Union will face together with accession of the Ukraine. So they are paying attention to our different articles and different ideas that about the changing inside of Ukraine, inside of the European Union, the qualified majority voting things, and so on. And I am receiving a lot of questions on that regard.
Yes, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you, because there are many ideas of how to make the process more functional of enlargement. I mean, in the Western Balkans, there's a strong sense that the process is not really giving results. So I'm just wondering, of all the ideas which have been floating around, you've mentioned qualified majority voting for the accession process, this Franco-German proposal, which suggests reducing the veto rights. But also there's the other ideas of the so-called staged accession. You might be familiar with the idea of not joining in one, but having, more structural funds earlier, but then when joining, not having all the privileges of membership and then getting those later. So having multiple steps towards joining. Which of those ideas is in a certain way, in your view, would be the most fruitful for bringing Ukraine into the European Union?
So I will talk about my personal views, because there is no, till this moment, official governmental position on that regard. So my personal view here is that any idea that will bring Ukraine closer to the EU membership and to all of the benefits that European Union is giving to EU members is acceptable. But of course, we would like for this process to be dynamic. So, for example, like the accession negotiations and implementation of the EU directives and regulations, this is not about, only about the final aim on joining to the EU, but it is also about the changes inside Ukraine. So I would like for EU to concentrate maybe the access to the structural funds, or maybe to some privileges, with understanding of what kind of differences it will make inside of Ukrainian society. For example, like I just talked with my colleagues from Western Balkans about the problems of implementation of all of the environmental directives and regulations. For example, like water directive and everything. But with implementation of those acquis, we are changing the real situation and the real, maybe, way of life of Ukrainians. So we have to pay attention a little bit more to that flip of the coin. And I think that it's probably one of the positive things is in the European integration, that it's constantly changing the way of life into more economic prosper and with more rights. So I think that we will probably work more on that communication. But as you may know, this kind of changes, this implementation of the EU acquis will demand a lot of funds. So together with colleagues from the DG NIR, we are concentrating the efforts for this recently announced Ukraine facility fund would be more concentrated on support for Ukraine to implement those EU regulations that could bring good changes for Ukrainian society during the accession negotiations.
Yeah. And you mentioned also your exchange with the partners in the Western Balkans. I mean, I guess my question would be, how do you see that relationship between Ukraine, which is joining the club together with Moldova, of candidate countries, with the countries in the Western Balkans? Do you see yourself as, in a certain way, part of a joint club? Or how do you see the benefits and the relations for Ukraine in this process with the countries in the Western Balkans?
I think that they have very good experience. They have some good experience and some lessons to be learned for Ukraine. I think that we will probably exchange, we will ask them for support and maybe exchange of their experience with all of the screening, how that works, how the accession negotiation works and so on. So, the practical side of this process. But of course, I felt that during this workshop in Lithuania, in Vilnius, that we are, of course, in the same process, but the EU is still, European Union is already on the negotiations with Western Balkans, and they know their strengths and weaknesses in this process. But they are still discovering Ukraine in this process. So I could compare our progress maybe after the start of the negotiations or even after the end of the official screening. So on the political point of view, I really felt that Ukraine brought the new chapter of the enlargement policy. I really felt that we brought more energy, more dynamic. I think that this kind of seminar 2 years ago without Ukraine was a little bit more boring exercise. But right now it's more about politics. It's more about, of course, about the accession negotiations and implementation of acquis, but it's getting more dynamic, and Ukraine brought that window of opportunity to the process, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very correct observation, and I think even that I hope, sincerely, that the enthusiasm and the kind of energy of Ukraine for enlargement is something which will have a beneficial and a positive effect on the Western Balkans, and not the other way around in terms of the lack of enthusiasm we're seeing sometimes in the Western Balkans in keeping the process going. That's not going to color off on the Ukraine, but the other way around.
Yeah, I talked with chief negotiators from, for example, Albania and North Macedonia. They are right now more excited than a few years ago. It's a big difference, big shift. They are ready to do the homework in order to proceed, and they are, already almost graduates, and we are on the starting point, on the first or second grade, and they are sharing with us what kind of teachers are right, what are the other teachers, and this good subjects and bad subjects. I really like that during those seminars, and I think that the good way to look on this is a collaboration. It's not about some clash or something like that. The good way is to look on that as the collaboration, because this will bring a result to all of us. I don't believe that Ukraine will join EU earlier than some front runners in the Western Balkans. I think that this window that Charles Michel announced during his speech about the 2030, this is one of the points that we have to look on, and maybe some internal deadlines that we have to talk about.
Indeed, great. Ivan, good luck with that, and thank you so much for talking. So talking to Ivan and talking to Maria highlighted to me really how much there is quite a different perspective in Ukraine when it comes to enlargement than in the Western Balkans. There's a lot more optimism, but there's also, as Ivan talked about, the importance of the enlargement process being the light at the end of the tunnel. So it has a very important function at the time of aggression which Ukraine is facing. Of course, a very different context for the Western Balkans, and whether or not that experience can help transform the process overall remains to be seen. But certainly, as both have highlighted, there is great opportunity in bringing Ukraine and the Western Balkans closer together.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
Hello, and welcome to the second part of our podcast. Today, we will be talking with two guests, with Jelena Jankic and Veronika Angel. Jelena is a part-time professor at the Robert Schuman Center of the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. She is director of the GGP. And also with us is Veronika Angel. She is a lecturer at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Today, we will be discussing an edited book with the title A Year Later, War in Ukraine and the Western Balkan Geopolitics. This book was edited by Jelena Jankic, Simonida Kaczarska, and Søren Kyle. It was published by the European University Institute in 2023. The book has a total of 24 chapters, 5 of them which were written by BiEPAG members. The book is published in open access, and the link will be in the description of the podcast. Now, Jelena, as one of the editors, you came up with the rationale for the book. Essentially, you ask how changing geopolitics following the Russian invasion of Ukraine impacted the Western Balkans 1 year after the invasion started. Can you walk us through what motivated this book and what has changed in the months since, if anything?
Thank you for the opportunity to actually talk about the book and the rationale for bringing together all the contributors, including the BiEPAG members. Now, we often hear in the media, but also in policy circles, that the world has changed on February 24th, 2020. Now, we could see in the year following the Russian aggression quite a lot of developments in the Western Balkans that have been sparked by the new geopolitical shifts. And we could see a lot of developments both in political and in economic terms. So these developments included shifts in the domestic politics, fractures on the regional level, and some changes in the EU's approach towards the region. Now, in the book, we wanted to explore these different dimensions of change within a year from the start of the war. And we realized that the best way to do this is to co-create a volume engaging 25 influential scholars and policymakers from the Western Balkans, from the EU, but also from across the Atlantic. As to your question on what has changed since, so first, we see a perpetuating instability in the region, and in a lot of cases, we see heightened tensions. And two, at the EU level, we see a lot of discussion about the need to use enlargement as a geopolitical tool. But at the same time, we see hesitance to put this into practice. And I hope that we'll be able to perhaps address some of these issues in a follow-up volume.
Now, obviously, the EU and enlargement feature prominently as a geopolitical strategy throughout several chapters. Veronika, you wrote the lead chapter that casts a huge question mark on whether the current EU enlargement approach actually works, or whether it can work in the future. And this being regardless of the new geopolitical circumstances after the Russian invasion. Can you walk us through your line of arguments in that chapter?
So in this chapter, which I co-authored with Eric Jones, our colleague at the Robert Schuman Center, the European University Institute, we really try to emphasize that the credibility of EU membership for Ukraine, Moldova, and the countries of the Western Balkans hinges on member states' flexibility regarding entry criteria and even more flexibility regarding the meaning of membership. So here's what we mean. In its past, the European Union has faced similar situations where it had to very reluctantly, which we forget, but very reluctantly consider enlargement. And it was usually prompted by external pressures, right? So enlargement has historically mostly been a reaction to events. And those were mostly security-related events, whether it was Central and Eastern Europe in the early 2000s, we can talk about that later on, or the awkward situation that was developing between Cyprus and Turkey that is still an ongoing issue. So as the security imperative for the European Union enlargement increases, we argue that the requirements for entry tend to fall. So yet again, the European Union finds itself in a predictable situation in a way to which it reacts in similar ways, in ways that it has reacted before, transforming the enlargement process into a stabilization tool for its own security. It doesn't actually want enlargement, but it doesn't know in a way what other tool to use to secure itself. And this is a search that we're witnessing a search right now for the best solution. And this search is obvious when you review some of the documents that the EU has been producing in the last years before the full-scale invasion and since. So the EU has acknowledged, as the specialists on the Western Balkans would know, that it has acknowledged its credibility problem in several of its documents. And from its 2011 enlargement strategy towards the Western Balkans to its 2020 so-called new enlargement methodology, to the latest EU Western Balkans summit that took place in Tirana in 2022. So in this 2018 document, the EU acknowledged, and I quote from the chapter, in the 2018 document, EU enlargement is described as, and I'm quoting, an investment in the EU's security, economic growth, and influence, and its ability to protect its citizens. So security needs drive the EU to become a geopolitical actor. Then such documents show that having the Western Balkans in would strengthen the EU's security. But not all EU documents share the same vision, and this is the uncertainty and the search that I was talking about earlier, because if you look at the EU's strategic compass for security and defense, the Western Balkans are defined as outside partner, right, with whom some sort of tailor-made partnerships have to be created alongside Eastern and Southern neighborhood, like in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So it's a very complicated situation for the European Union in which it has to define for itself what it wants to do with the candidate states. And that's why we end up asking if the EU can simultaneously build a security strategy around having countries from the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova in and having them out at the same time.
Now, we see that security is a major concern. And Yelena, we don't see a quick end to the Ukraine war at the same time. What would you say to policymakers who argue that the EU should heavily prioritize geopolitical concerns at the moment and even use an enlargement tool to achieve this?
Well, I'd say that there needs to be a balanced approach. We know that the EU has deployed the promise of membership as a geopolitical tool. And in so doing, it has essentially created expectations in the Eastern Partnership countries and above all in Ukraine and Moldova of future membership. But also it's raised the hopes of the Western Balkan countries that they will accede to the European Union in a slightly shorter time frame that was originally expected. And how to manage those expectations that have been created and to deploy a credible strategy towards candidates and potential candidates will be one of the key political questions in the coming years. So I think that geopolitical enlargement is one thing, but the promise of membership that has been deployed in this context is a completely different issue, and one does not imply the other.
Given all of these recent repeated mentions of reviving the enlargement process, Veronica, do you think that it still holds true that Western Balkans do not rank highly on the EU's agenda? Or just to ask you more directly, is the EU suddenly afraid it will lose the Western Balkans?
I believe that the enlargement to the Western Balkans certainly doesn't appear to be a priority for Europeans. I'm speaking in earnest. Ukraine is definitely the EU's and NATO's priority here. And it's due to its size, its geographic position, the geopolitical importance, and Russia's obvious determination to completely erase this country from the map. And not least because the United States is involved in this process and it supports a Ukraine-dominated agenda as well. So sadly, the Western Balkans are mostly collaterally brought into the principal conversation, which is focusing on Ukraine. If there will be any flexibility shown towards enlargement for a country in the Western Balkans, then it will likely be the outcome of a strategy of some sort to show to the people of Ukraine and Moldova that there is some space for enlargement, that enlargement is still credible. But to do that, the EU has to find a way to do that at minimal cost. And the current architecture of voting and of including the countries as full members wouldn't allow that.
Thank you very much. Now, in the first segment of the podcast, Florian spoke to Ukrainian leaders who emphasized the need for closer cooperation between their country and the Western Balkans. Asking both of you, is there anything the Western Balkans can teach Ukraine about the enlargement process? And also the other way around, what can Ukraine teach the Western Balkans? Yelena, maybe you first.
Now, regretfully, in many ways, the Western Balkans can teach Ukraine what not to do. So the region offers a series of important lessons on what happens in divided societies, post-war zones, contested and captured states, sites of democratic decline, but also sites where foreign and malign influences can dominate domestic context. So trying to avoid the Western Balkan scenarios in these domains is the most important lesson that the region can offer. And what Ukraine can teach the Western Balkans is above all resilience and how to use the momentum. So I think that these would be the key lessons on both sides.
Veronica?
That chapter that we mentioned at the beginning in the book edited by Yelena and her colleagues, we draw a lot of lessons from the European Union's enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe since 2004. And also to the Western Balkans. So successful and stalled enlargement processes as well. So, and this is something that can really instruct the way we can look at this process going forward. Because if we look at the case of Central and Eastern Europe, this shift from having strict Copenhagen-style criteria to broadening the candidate pool stemmed from concerns about potential conflicts akin to those in the former Yugoslavia, and other signs of de-democratization, anti-European sentiment that were already starting to emerge in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, not like in Slovakia or Hungary, not to mention Romania and Bulgaria. So this idea of a flexible accession that we're trying to put forward, and as parenthesis, it's also something that a lot of people from the EU right now are investing time and money in explaining to everyone that it should be the best way to move forward. So to rethink what membership means, to rethink what enlargement means. This is something that we've been trying to say that it's useful in these conversations going forward. So in this sense, Ukraine has to be flexible regarding its participation in the EU, but it also has to ask for everything. So for as much as the EU can give, because the EU will never give as much as Ukraine needs, and that's important to note. And the Ukraine has to make itself indispensable to the European security architecture and its economy, its labor market. And there are ways to do this and ways to learn from the successful enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe and all the ways in which these countries have connected to the European Union before they became full members.
Now, shifting back to a Western Balkans view, all of this talk of re-engaging with enlargement, of trying to jumpstart enlargement, Yelena, how has this increased European interest been perceived in Western Balkan countries? Is there any interest? And can you maybe give an example?
Yeah, I think that the increased interest falls largely in the domain of perceptions. And if we think about it, there are differences across countries. So we can see perhaps an increased enthusiasm in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Albania, obviously due to candidacy for Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in Albania due to an enhanced, perhaps momentum even for enlargement, the EU Western Balkans Summit of 2022 that took place in Tirana. So perhaps in these countries, the renewed interest of the EU is more visible and palpable, and thus something that drives some political processes. Now, in North Macedonia, the opening of accession negotiations came with a bitter pill. So I would say that in this country, there's a bit less enthusiasm over the EU's renewed interest, I would say. Kosovo, Montenegro, and Serbia, on the other hand, well, they seem to be caught up in their own inward-looking moment. So I don't see that the interest of the EU in the region can actually reach the societies of Kosovo, Montenegro, and Serbia at this moment.
So, Veronica, now back to you. Based on your research and expertise, and there has been a lot of this talk about a fixed deadline for accession. 2030 has been mentioned quite often recently. Is this something that could motivate candidate countries to reform, even though they might not be willing to?
Well, also listening to what Jelena just had to say, then I'm even more confident in my answer to rather say that all countries need to reform to their own benefit, regardless of the EU. And that's important to mention, and it's not just small talk. But if we talk about a deadline that is fixed for 2030, I do not think that is realistic in any way. It's a bet that I am willing and happy to lose, and I participate in losing, but it's very unlikely. What we can expect is that the EU leaders will decide to open accession talks with Kyiv by the end of this year, and that, if not followed by some sort of equal offering towards the Western Balkans as well, will only overall increase the absence of the credibility of the EU enlargement process.
And maybe a follow-up question to that. How can a 27-member European Union even approach enlargement today? It will be different in this round. And can there be a credible commitment if there are no changes to EU rules or EU documents?
I think that the EU cannot make a credible commitment to the governments of candidate countries because of the veto scare. This is it's a real conversation that is taking place, and Hungary is currently considered more than enough to deal with in the Council. And as long as the governments of these countries are not pristine in their democracy and rule of law and anti-corruption credential, and there is no more worry of reversibility when it comes to rule of law, which is an impossible target to reach right now. So as long as that doesn't happen, they will not be admitted as equal partners around the table with veto rights. So the commitment that is credible is a commitment towards the citizens of these countries to connect them as much as possible to everything that the European Union has to offer, and it is appealing and desirable for, which is accessibility to the labor market, to academia, to international trade schemes, to security, the little security that the European Union can offer. All these things are commitments to their citizens, but commitments to the governments is not that credible, I think.
This is a very important discussion to have. And I thank both of you for taking your time to join us in this conversation. Jelena Jankic, thank you very much. Veronica Angel, thank you very much. I once again want to emphasize that the book, A Year Later, War in Ukraine and the Western Balkan, Geopolitics, is available open access at the link in the description. Thank you.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
So Damir, you've heard what I've brought back from Kiev and the conversations. What strikes you the most in the two Ukrainian colleagues I've talked to?
Well, there are two things that strike me most. One is this optimism that you could hear from both their conversations and voices, that they see accession and enlargement as something that actually benefits Ukraine and that they're really willing to go forward with. The second thing is that And they see the relationship in a session with the Western Balkans as a collaboration, not so much as a competition. They emphasize this several times, that there are things that they can learn from the Western Balkans and that they can maybe also sort of bring into that relationship as well.
Yeah, indeed. I think it was really striking. I mean, the kind of sense of optimism, the sense of purpose, and also how they didn't see this as, we want to come first in line. We're respecting that the Western Balkans have been at this for a while. So I think this is actually quite encouraging in many ways when, the sort of
definitely
how enriching it can be.
Yes, definitely.
So,
Florian, what did you take away from my conversation with Jelena and Veronica?
Yeah, I mean, I think there, which was striking, is of course how much there has been, so little of a Zeitenwende in the Western Balkans. I mean, this is really quite the contrast to the first part, where you actually don't see a major shift in the way in which enlargement is discussed in the Western Balkans, and that kind of comes out in the conversation, but also in the way the EU talks to the Western Balkans. So it seems still like very two separate conversations going on. One, about and with Ukraine, and from the Ukraine to the EU side, and one in the Western Balkans, which seems strangely unaffected by the war, and where, the shifts have been much more minute and much smaller than, one could have expected if we had this conversation back in, February or March of last year.
Yes, I agree with this. There have been some elements that have shifted, but then others where it's basically still business as usual, you could say, as the same as in the past 10 to 15 years.
Indeed. So I think maybe the kind of key takeaway from our podcast this week is that it's really kind of helpful to bring Ukraine into the equation to think about enlargement. I mean, of course, there's also Moldova and, to some degree also Georgia in the background. But it really, I think, helps to rethink it, enlargement, and also to revitalize it. And I think a bit of that kind of contagious optimism can be really helpful in the Western Balkans. So, I would say my takeaway is I hope that the Western Balkan accession process will take on some of the optimism from the Ukraine, and Ukraine not so much of the cynicism which the enlargement process has taken on in the Western Balkans.
Exactly. Well, maybe some of the caution.
Some of the caution, some of the realism certainly would be useful, and I think both of our interlocutors in Ukraine are aware that this is not a short-term game, but something which requires a bit of a stamina and time. But again, interesting times ahead in terms of also the enlargement strategy packages coming out in the coming months from the European Union, and it's going to be interesting to see how they will integrate the Ukraine with the Western Balkan enlargements. So much more to talk about in future podcasts. So thanks for joining us. Tune in and follow us on all of our channels where we are available. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks. This podcast is produced by the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, a joint project of the European Fund for the Balkans and the Center for Southeast European Studies of the University of Graz. Find out more about our research, analysis, and advocacy at www.biepag.eu.